somebody is out here fighting for you and somebody cares about you and somebody loves you. Because I always say that while I was incarcerated, I never heard the good stories ever. The only thing that you would hear is people coming back in and saying about how hard it is.
Welcome to the One Girl Revolution podcast. I'm your host, Kate Bryan, and I am happy to be back here for another inspiring episode of the One Girl Revolution podcast in our Incarceration and Women series. As you know by now, women are the fastest growing population in jail and prison. There are so many facets to women and their stories, and we believe that every woman has a story to tell, that every woman's life and story has purpose, and that every woman has the power to change the world through her life. This is yet another episode that embodies all of those things. Before we get into this week's episode, please subscribe to the One Girl Revolution podcast on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Stitcher, iHeartRadio, YouTube, or wherever you listen to podcasts. Please follow us on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram at One Girl Revo. Subscribe to us on YouTube, One Girl Revolution, and check out our website, onegirlrevolution.com, for more podcast episodes, videos, and so much more. Also, don't forget to check out our Emmy-nominated short documentary, The Girl Inside, on YouTube. You can find it on YouTube or also on our website. This week's episode of the One Girl Revolution podcast features Syrita Steib, founder of Operation Restoration. Syrita was incarcerated herself for numerous years and experienced the difficulties of re-entering the world after serving time in prison. So much in the world and culture had changed throughout her time that she was incarcerated. And when she got out, she had to deal with finding a job, a home, and all the things needed to get her life back. Operation Restoration sparked out of Syrita's own experience, and now she's helping other women and girls who are impacted by incarceration. Operation Restoration supports women and girls impacted by incarceration to recognize their full potential, restore their lives, and discover new possibilities. Operation Restoration started out by just providing goods and having a closet of clothes and necessities for women and girls that they were serving. But now they're a thriving organization with countless programs and projects geared to support and empower women and girls. Syrita joins the One Girl Revolution podcast to share her own life story, her experience with incarceration, what she experienced when she got out, including being responsible for $1.9 million in restitution and then being pardoned earlier this year. She talks about the struggles that incarcerated women and formerly incarcerated women face. She talks about the incredible work that Operation Restoration is doing to make a difference in the world, and so much more. So let's get to it. Here's Syrita. Syrita, welcome to the One Girl Revolution podcast.
Thank you so much for having me. I appreciate being here today.
I am really excited to share your story and your incredible work. As I mentioned to you before we started recording, our mutual friend, Kim Bogugi, sang your praises, and she was like, you have to have Syrita on. So thank you so much for making the time to come on the podcast. And I'm excited to get into everything with regards to you and your story and your great work. But before we get into that, I'd love to hear from you. Who is a One Girl Revolution in your own life? Who's a woman or girl that's inspired you?
Wow, it's so many. I think if you think about like just out in the atmosphere, people who I'm inspired by, I would definitely have to, oh gosh, there's so many. Angela Davis is always the first person that comes to mind for me because I think I read her quote, I don't know, a few years back, and I'm sure I had seen it before, but then it said, you know, something along the lines of she was no longer going to accept the things that she could not change. She was going to change the things that she could not accept. And I think that quote came about in a time in my life where I was ready to actually receive it. And that is how I started approaching the work that I'm doing currently, is because, you know, I chose not to accept the things that, you know, I thought I couldn't change, but change the things that I couldn't accept. So the work that I get up and do every day, it's in that vein. Personally, I can say, you know, it's just so many women. I think I'm inspired by like just working in the community that I work in and in the space that I work in, about women who decide to get up every day and like change their circumstances, you know, that they want to do something different and change their trajectory. So I think I get my daily inspiration from the women that we meet and we help. And every time we hear like a success story, and we define success however a woman wants to be defined as successful. I think for me, that's like my daily inspiration.
Well, you are such an inspiration to me, and I know so many other people out there. I want to rewind and talk about your story. So your early life, if we can take a second and just rewind to your early life, who you are and where you're from, and just a little bit about your upbringing.
Yeah, of course. So I grew up in a small town in Louisiana called Bastrop. So I am a country girl by heart. I'm very proud of it. I've been living in the New Orleans metro area probably now about 11 years since I had been released from incarceration. But I always spent some bit of time between the country and the city because my mom's family is also in the city, and a lot of her work was in the city. Growing up, my mom was an attorney and then became a judge. My father was a supervisor in an oil refinery. He used to be a teacher. And I grew up in the household with my sister, Aspen. So that's kind of like where I'm from and my family dynamic. I graduated from high school. I had a scholarship to college in physics and engineering. I'm also former military. I was in the Navy for a while. So it's kind of like my early childhood and upbringing ish.
Yeah, and I think that that's important for people to know, because when you think about incarceration or you think about people that have gone through the justice system, we always have this idea of the quote unquote type of person that ends up in jail or prison. And so I think just sharing a little bit about your background, that it's like it can look like a whole lot of things. But then you had your own experience with incarceration when you were 19 years old. Can you share a little bit about that?
Yeah, so absolutely. I think it's always important too for me to frame like my childhood and like the type of resources that I had access to, just to reinforce that there's this myth around who goes to prison, who shows up in prison. The one thing that I do know that connects most women to prison, or all women to prison, is trauma, and not, going through or dealing with the effects of your traumatic experiences. So I know myself at a really early age, I was a victim of physical abuse. And then once I was a teenager, I experienced sexual abuse as well. And I think that, by the time I was 19, I had a myriad of different circumstances and unresolved trauma that kind of led me to my journey with incarceration. So, even though I had this scholarship to college and I was in the military, I still was making decisions through trauma and traumatic experiences. So I think that, that is very important for your listeners to know that that's the one commonality in women, for the most part, men too, but, specifically in women, is their experience with trauma, irrespective of whatever socioeconomic background or education level people come from. So I went to prison at 19, like you mentioned, and I served almost 10 years. I was released at the age of 29 into society, with a lack of resources and skills, because prior to me going in, the internet didn't exist. And once I got out, we were in a totally digital smartphone world, and I didn't have any experience with that stuff.
That must have been so surreal to like go in to prison and then come out. And now, even I feel like in the past couple of years, so much has changed. And so I can only imagine being inside for 10 years and then getting out with iPhones and social media. And then it just was a total, probably culture shock.
Yes, absolutely. Total culture shock. It was almost to the point of like, I don't know if the best way I could describe it is like being kidnapped, held captive, and then just being released out and say, hey, go out and like thrive and figure out what's going on, you know. But then also there's like a level of shame and humiliation, because when you go places and people are expecting you to know certain things, you know, they want to know like why you don't know this thing, you know. So it's a really isolating feeling, and almost like you know, I don't know, suffering in silence, because you don't want to tell people that the reason you don't know your bra size and your cup size is because you wore small, medium, and large sports bras for the last 10 years. You know, you don't want to tell people that you don't know what's going on in the fashion world today, or you don't know how to dress for an interview, because they want to know, well, why don't you know these things? And, you know, somehow, some way, what you don't know, especially as a formerly incarcerated person, becomes some level of not being educated, or a lack of intelligence. And that's the last thing that you want to portray when you're trying to, like, you know, reintegrate yourself into society, because there's so many things you're already insecure about. But then because you don't know certain things, you somehow are not intelligent, you know?
Yeah, it's got to be so difficult. And I've had different women on this podcast who have shared their own experiences with incarceration and getting out. But that's something that I really have always wanted to encourage our listeners to think about, is when you get out of jail or prison, you have to start from scratch, right? Like there's nobody that's holding your hand. For the most part. I know there are more and more organizations, and I want to talk about the great work that you're doing. More and more organizations and individuals who have had experiences, and they work through their own experiences to help others. But for you getting out, it's like you have to find a job, and you also have to tell that you were incarcerated. And there are so many jobs that won't hire people because they have a record. And so just learning how to kind of dig yourself out, not just getting out of prison, but then learning how to get back on your feet. What was that experience like for you?
I mean, I've always been the type of person, I think that, you know, school has always come really easy to me. So it was okay for me to like learn, or I wasn't afraid of like the learning component. I think what was the most scariest though is like not knowing what you don't know, and also not really understanding like the depth of how far you're behind in society that now exists like in a totally different way. You know, I have to give a shout out to like other formerly incarcerated women that I was incarcerated with, that really, really held my hand through the process and like showed me how to, you know, do certain things. Like I always talk about how when I got ready to go to school, it was another formerly incarcerated woman who had experience with a FAFSA who taught me how to do that thing. Another one bought me a phone and walked me through how to use a new smartphone. Another one came with me to get my birth certificate and social security card, because I was also coming back to New Orleans post Katrina, and a lot of things hadn't come back yet, or hadn't been rebuilt, or, you know, the things that I was looking for to anchor me inside of my community no longer existed because they were destroyed, you know, in Katrina. So I think that had it not been for other formerly incarcerated women who actually like were there for me once I was released, I don't know what my reentry would have looked like, or how it would have been, or even, you know, currently where I would be. I like to think that I had enough, you know, will and fortitude to like make it through whatever. But, you know, at the end of the day, you know, it's also really, really about dispelling this myth around you can pull yourself up by the bootstraps and get through anything. Like that doesn't exist really for people of color in this country that we currently live in. So I think, you know, it's a combination of like people showing me, you know, how to jump over the hurdle versus going around it. And then also, you know, the introductions of other formerly incarcerated folks to people that they knew could help me and that had helped them made the transition just a lot better.
Yeah. And that's a really important point, I think, for all of us, is we've all gone through different things. And I'm a firm believer that sometimes we go through things in order to help other people, of course, like help ourselves. But I think there's something really special when numerous people have gone through the same thing. And so even what you're doing now, where you're able to build this army, build this community that supports people. But it all starts with us, each and every one of us making a difference and helping and supporting people, because you're right. Like, we can't always just pull ourselves up by the bootstraps. We need support. So one thing about your story, Syrita, that I want to ask you about, because it's something that I didn't know until I was researching some things about your story and watching some interviews with you, is when you got out, you owed $2 million in restitution. And so that was, monthly payments you were having to somehow figure out how to make. So not only are you trying to get a job, get your life back on track, get your life together, but on top of that, you have to make these monthly payments. And thankfully you were pardoned. Can you share a little bit about that? Because that's one thing that I hadn't even thought about. And I think that a lot of people that are listening, they probably haven't thought about either.
So no, I was actually just pardoned on Trump's last day in office in January of this year. So it was, January 2021, his last day in office at midnight. So, he was out of office by noon. So literally 12 hours before he got out of office, I received the news that I had been pardoned. But the restitution, is just another way of continuing to like overly punish folks. Here I am 19, guilty of the crime I was accused of course, but I'm also a victim of like mandatory minimum. So even though I had never been in trouble and never had a conviction on my record and had numerous people willing to stand in the gap for me to say, hey, we know that this is not her. I was in the military, had some college education, whatever. Because of the mandatory minimum, the judge had no choice but to give me 10 years in prison, because there's something called the Mandatory Victims Restitution Act, because the crime that I committed was against a person's business. I also was sentenced under that statute, which meant that even though there were 4 of us, that we are collectively as well as individually responsible for the debt. So one person can pay everything, or 4 people can pay it, but it doesn't matter who's paying what, because you're all responsible for the same amount, individually and collectively. And it's like an IRS debt. You can't file bankruptcy. You can't be discharged from it. I mean, there's all these different things to just make sure that you're saddled with this for the rest of your life. So I felt like, my sentence was really excessive in the sense that I received 10 years in federal prison, 20 years in state prison, $1.9 million in restitution. And it was all ran concurrent, but it was all from the same incident, so it wasn't like one or the other, or it was multiple, things that happened at once. It was the same single incident, and all of these, charges stem from this. And I was 19, so there was no consideration for my earning capacity, what I would be able to make, within the rest of my life, or anything of that sort. And I think that, I did this study and this paper on how restitution is like the new life sentence, because you pay while you're incarcerated. And if you don't pay while you're incarcerated, which is really your family paying while you're incarcerated, right? Because you don't really make money while you're incarcerated. So you pay while you're incarcerated. If you don't pay while you're incarcerated, you can lose your visitation, you can lose your commissary, you can lose your telephone privileges and all of these different things, because they want you to pay while you're incarcerated. And as soon as you get out, you're expected to pay. But there's like all of these barriers for me to obtain education and employment and housing. So, before I even address any of those things, I have to make this payment. And then, no matter how much I progress in life, or no matter how much I give back, or I separate myself from the choices I made 20 years ago, I'm still expected to pay this. So it became like this big albatross around my neck forever. I used to think about it all of the time. I've had situations where financially I've been in tough positions, and I had my son at the time, and now my daughter. And like, how does that affect their life? Because they weren't even around when I made this choice. I'm 41 now, so 21 years ago, and they are still saddled with this.
Mm. I know so many people, and I'm sure you do too, that have so many student loans and they're not even sure how they're going to be able to make their payments every month for the rest of their lives. And so I just looked at that number, the 1.9 million, and I was like, I don't even know how you would even begin to pay that off. And so that must have felt like such a relief, because on top of that, it probably has opened up so many more opportunities for you to do the great work that you're doing because you don't have that hanging around your neck.
Yeah, because one of the things of the Mandatory Victims Restitution Act is that you cannot own or have anything in excess. And that is so subjective, right? So it's based on who your auditor is out of the financial litigation unit that is holding your restitution. And then the other thing about restitution is that like people have this assumption that if you're paying restitution, you're paying it directly to the victim, right? So in my case, my victim was made whole by the insurance company. The insurance company didn't sue me to pay back their money. So this is something that the federal government pursued, and my restitution goes into this big pot of restitution, and it's doled out to many victims. So, my money may not even go to my victim in the case, because like I said, mine was made whole through insurance, right? So if the insurance company decided to go after me in like a civil litigation suit or something of the sort, then I could understand, that process or whatever. But this is something that the federal government put in place, and there's like all of this money, and it's just shelled out to different people that are owed restitution. There's a lot, the last time I looked at it, I think it was about $60 billion in uncollected restitution, right? That, because then if you don't pay and you're not at risk of being reincarcerated, they'll put a judgment on your credit or a lien on properties or, just anything of the sort. And it's, again, subjective. It's based on what you are deemed to have in excess by that financial litigator, So I remember like the day I graduated from college, probably like not even a few days later, I got a call from the financial litigator in the Eastern District of Texas telling me that they were auditing me to see if I could pay more money and when that could start. And then at the time, I was married to my ex-husband, and they were like, well, we could take his money. And I'm like, well, no, we signed a prenuptial agreement, so actually you can't. But then they turned around and said, well, since his income is enough to pay all of the bills, then your whole income can be seized, It's just like, what? I'm here barely making it, working a job while I'm in school. And it's like, this is what you're calling to tell me. But it was almost as if they knew I was getting ready to expand my earning potential, and they wanted to increase my payments in advance of that, So it almost gets to be like loan sharkish, and like in hot pursuit of somebody to pay this money. It's horrible.
Yeah. Well, I'm glad. Thank you for sharing all of that, because I think it's important for us to be thinking about, because I didn't know, I hadn't even thought of it. If you're enjoying this episode of the One Girl Revolution podcast, you can see more about the lives, struggles, hopes, and dreams of incarcerated women in One Girl Revolution's The Girl Inside on YouTube. The Girl Inside is a short documentary. It's only 10 minutes, so not a huge commitment, that features the stories and voices of 5 incarcerated women at Cook County Jail and an academic storytelling class that changed their lives. The link is in the show notes. Please watch and share The Girl Inside today. And now back to the show. Syrita, I want to get into the good stuff, the beautiful stuff that you're doing now. Talk to me about Operation Restoration. How did this idea spark? I'm always curious about people's, these little spark moments, these suddenly moments where you kind of find your purpose or find your purpose in a new way. How did Operation Restoration come to be?
So Operation Restoration came to be out of like pure necessity, like when I was released from prison, the conversation was around mass incarceration, specifically as it related to men. All of the resources that were out there were geared toward men, all of the conversations, all of the help, all of those things. When I got out of prison, I was like, I want to go to college. I had taken some college courses while I was incarcerated, and I didn't know that, a collateral consequence consequence of going to prison was a denial of education or a denial of housing or denial of employment. It's like, I don't know if I was like on another planet prior to going to prison or like what, but I didn't know that all of these other things happened as a result of a conviction, you know? So going to school and applying to school and getting rejected getting rejected to go to college because of my criminal conviction was like a shocking to me. Like I didn't have a plan B, you know? And then the struggles that I had with getting access to clothing when I got out, you know, like I was released and I had a friend who bought like some clothing and my mom brought a couple of things and some hygiene items. And I had about $800 in cash. And it was like, here, start over. And I went to Dress for Success and like all of these different places that gave out like free clothing. And there was nowhere where I could get underwear or socks or bras or, you know, anything. So initially, the organization was started in order to provide those services, like help with education and clothing and direct services. And the closet was created, and we started working on educational opportunities for currently and formerly incarcerated women. So that was the moment, because it was just like, hey, this is some total and complete bullshit, you know, like we don't have access to anything, nothing, you know, as women being released. So how can we begin to address that? You know, so it was more so out of necessity.
Yeah. Well, talk to me about Operation Restoration now. Tell me about all the great work that you guys do. I know it's evolved and grown since that moment when you started it, but what is Operation Restoration and what do you do?
So Operation Restoration is an organization that was created to address as many barriers as possible for currently and formerly incarcerated women and girls, and helping them to re-enter society by removing as many of those barriers as possible. Present day, we have 15 programs inside of Operation Restoration, and we employ 15 full-time employees and over 20 contractors to get these services out into the community. We have a pretty robust education department where we have a women's first clinic that we pair women to services that support them in achieving their high school equivalency. So we do tutoring and educational services for those women, but at the same time, we provide childcare and transportation and a snack to support these women in obtaining their high school equivalency. We have a college and prison program in partnership with Tulane University, where we have 40 women that are currently enrolled in our college and prison program, and they are working toward a Bachelor of Social Sciences. And Tulane has been such an amazing partner in this endeavor. The women are Tulane students. They get Tulane transcripts. They're taught by Tulane professors, and Tulane has waived tuition for these women. We are in the process of getting the site accredited so we can really enroll more women and start figuring out how we can connect more people in the state of Louisiana to this educational opportunity. We also are getting ready to launch a lab assistant program. You know, one thing that the pandemic did expose is our shortage of laboratory personnel, which people in the lab already knew this for a long period of time. That is my what my license and my certification is in, clinical laboratory science. And we are launching a program to get currently and formerly incarcerated women certified and licensed as lab assistants, where they can work in the hospital labs. We do a lot of policy and advocacy work locally, on a citywide level, a statewide level, as well as federally. We have been involved in advocating and passing multiple levels of policy. Act 276 made Louisiana the first state to remove criminal history questions off of college applications for purposes of admission. We had a victory through a coalition that we founded to restore Pell funding back to individuals who are currently incarcerated. We have created task force to address the incarceration of women. We have passed legislation where women now have access to toilet paper and toothbrushes and sanitary items for free while they're incarcerated. So we do a lot of advocacy work as well. We have a community bail fund that we bond out local New Orleanians who cannot afford to pay bail for themselves. And that is the only reason that they are still sitting in a jail or detention facility is because of their inability to pay for their freedom. We also have a couple of programs that we're involved in the arts, as well as STEM. We just have a wide variety of things that we address and we work toward in order to, like I said, with the overarching mission of removing as many barriers as possible for incarcerated and formerly incarcerated women and girls.
Yeah, as I was going through your website, Syrita, I was like, oh my gosh, they do so much, and just seeing different things, all the different programs and things that you were sharing there. And it's amazing because some of them seem so little, even like childcare, providing childcare, but the power that that has for women just to give them freedom to pursue education and, education, we all know lowers the recidivism rate, by sometimes 40%, but it can be as much as 60 or 80%. And so you're pulling down those barriers and giving women just opportunity to chase their dreams and to be the person that they were created to be, which is just amazing.
Yeah, absolutely. Education, I think, lately we have always been talking about education as a tool to address like recidivism. And while I think that like education definitely has an impact on recidivism, like what I want us to always be careful of is that we're not using that as a tool to dictate how recidivism, is monitored or incentivized, right? I think that like if a person has access to their basic needs, I think, recidivism goes down as well. I think if a person has no housing insecurities and no food insecurities, that tackles recidivism, our employment, access to employment opportunities. I often tell people, I'm like, you can give a person a job and you can say, hey, here, I'm going to employ you. But like, if you're not invested in the person taking the job, so asking them, hey, do you have childcare to start your job? Do you have transportation to the job? Do you need help with uniforms or shoes or anything in order to start the job? Because just because you offer somebody a job, that opportunity can seem so far out of reach because there are things that need to happen in order for a person to just take advantage of the employment opportunity,
Yeah.
So we have to like offer these opportunities, but be invested in making sure that people can actually take advantage of the opportunity.
Yeah, I know. I totally agree. I want to ask you about this line on your website that I thought was really eye-opening, and you sort of alluded to it earlier in the interview. You have this line that says, no institution or system was designed for women and girls. And that just blew me away. I know you alluded to it earlier that so many of the systems and institutions that are in place with regards to the justice system are built for men. And finally, I feel like people's eyes are starting to be opened. And especially now that we know women are the fastest growing population within jail and prison, there are so many facets to the reasons why they end up incarcerated. Like you shared earlier, there's usually trauma involved and mental health issues and other things that are going on. And so we're finally opening our eyes to women and girls being incarcerated. But I just think that your work is so powerful, and that line just really hit me.
It even goes even deeper than that, right? It goes to the fact that before, like any system that was created in Benjamin Franklin's living room prior to him becoming an abolitionist, right? So the oldest hospital, the oldest prison, one of the oldest universities in the country were all created in his living room with white men for white men, because that was the truth of our country at the time. That's why the hospitals resemble the schools and they resemble the prisons. And, you can kind of walk into some of those buildings and it seems like those cinder block walls with those linoleum floors are everywhere, right? Or the gold standards that we use to measure great programs, or just all of these different things are rooted in those conversations that started in his living room with other white men. So when I say that no system was designed for women and girls, that is exactly what I mean. Not our school systems, not our hospital systems, not the prison systems, like nothing was designed. So you can't fix that. You can't make that better. You can't improve it. You have to create something that has inclusivity in mind, you know? And if we don't think as the United States, like we have the worst citizens in the whole country, and we don't have the worst citizens here in Louisiana than the rest of the world, we have to address like this fascination with incarceration, and we have to address why we handle issues that should not require criminalization, and how we can approach it differently.
Syrita, stories have the power to open our eyes and open our hearts and bring awareness and understanding. I'd love to hear a couple of stories, and I know that you have to protect different people's, their names and everything in the work that you're doing. But I'd love to hear a couple of stories of people that Operation Restoration has worked with.
Yeah, so I can think of a couple. Also, it's like, it's not even so much just like protecting identities. It's like allowing people the space to like tell their own stories. So that is always the space that we come from, like not silencing people by telling their stories, because we don't want anybody to silence us. But I think that a few things that I could tell you that make me get up and say, yeah, I'm going to work every day and continue to fight is, one in particular that always sticks out to me is there's this lady, we were in the midst of the pandemic and we were doing outreach under the bridge where most of the homeless people are now residing in Louisiana. And also I'm still training myself to speak properly. So people who are suffering from housing insecurities, not homelessness, live there, and I had this misconception that people who were suffering from housing insecurity and living outside in this encampment in New Orleans could not find employment or were not working. Like, I had no clue that people get up and go to work every day and still don't have somewhere to live. Right? Can't afford to live somewhere, and I really started doing work around like the minimum wage in Louisiana is still $7.25 or $7.15 or $7.25, something like that. And they say that you need to make at least $16 to $18 an hour not to live in poverty. So you can literally work 2 minimum wage jobs and still be in poverty in New Orleans. And I met this lady and she had been to the organization unbeknownst to me before to receive help with a gift card because a lot of people in our community couldn't get the stimulus or didn't have access to certain things, food stamps and all of this. And if they did, it still didn't cover like cleaning supplies and PPE. So we were giving out gift cards so people could go to Walmart and get the things that they needed. And she had been one of the women that came out. And then when we tried to because we were doing social distancing, we were taking down information and then doing phone calls to talk to people. And there was really no way to get back in contact with her. And she kind of fell through the cracks. She didn't have a phone. She didn't have an address, all of these things. And my staff didn't really pay attention to that at the time. They took down her information, but couldn't get back in contact with her. So I was under the bridge and I was passing out food. And I was like, hey, listen, if you ever feel like you want help getting out of this situation, come by the organization. And she's like, no, I've been to that organization and they don't help, And I was like, oh my God, what happened? So she's telling me what happened. And I was like, I'll be right back. And I went to the office, I got the gift card and I came back out and I told her who I was and that I ran the organization. I'm really sorry that happened to her, but there are services that we could help, like provide her a cell phone, help her to get work. And she was like, no, I work every day, and it began this relationship with her that we were able to move her and her husband into their first apartment and help them to get it furnished and, support her in getting stable so that she could begin to then take care of herself, getting better employment, not additional employment, and supporting her through that process. And it just made me so happy to see that transition from that point to where she is currently. Another young lady was released to our transition home after serving about 8 years. She didn't want to go back to the area that she was from, and she really wanted to come out and work. And like, she stayed in the house. She's been there a year. She just bought her a car. She just secured full-time employment, making, starting at $15 an hour. She has an apartment, it's furnished, and this is the first time that she's ever did that. So just having those experiences and watching those women go from a position of helplessness and hopelessness to a position where now they are even empowered to start helping others is always the best stories for me.
Yeah, those are really powerful stories. If you would like to hear more stories straight from women who have been incarcerated, check out One Girl Revolution's The Girl Inside on YouTube. One Girl Revolution took a film crew behind the walls of the largest single-site jail, Cook County Jail, and interviewed 5 incarcerated women. This short documentary highlights a life-changing academic class and the life and experiences of these 5 women, and what is revealed is the girl inside. You can watch The Girl Inside today on our website at onegirlrevolution.com. And now back to this episode of the One Girl Revolution podcast. Where does Operation Restoration go from here, and what's next on the horizon for you?
So next is always like scaling, right? And thinking about how you scale to bring what you're doing to other places. Well, we've created this program called Operation Innovation, where we fiscally sponsor other organizations or programs to do the work that we're doing in our community in the way that we do it in our community, but by responding to the needs of their community, right? So we don't have to physically go into someone else's community and create another Operation Restoration. We can go into someone else's community, find people who are doing the work that need that support, that back office support, or the infrastructure, or whatever support it is that they need to execute at the level that they need to execute for their community. And that is what we view as scaling. So we're really excited about that. And we really want to be able to pour so much more into that new program. I think that, what's next for Operation Restoration is that we're going to keep showing up and keep being there and keep doing what we need to do for currently and formerly incarcerated women. Like, we don't plan on going anywhere anytime soon, but what we are really, really focused on is creating other leaders to go out into the community and do the work that they see fit and support them to be, impactful leaders and not have to worry about, things that they should not be distracted from their time, right? And I also think that, what's next for us is to continue to grow and make sure that we are able to respond the same way each time, no matter what. So really getting clear and consistent with how we show up. So I think that's our immediate goals.
Well, I can't wait to see where you go from here. And I'm excited to continue to follow all the great work that you're doing. And hopefully One Girl Revolution can support you in any way that we possibly can for the future. It's just so inspiring to hear your story and just hear about your work. For people that are listening, if they could have one takeaway from your story and from the work that you're doing, if you could give people a challenge, I guess, what would it be? What do you hope that people learn from your story if you could open their eyes?
I think that the thing that I had to learn is that, in coaching and in conversation with these 2 guys from out of New Jersey, Mark and Jason, I had an experience called Fishberg. And what I heard one of them tell me one day is like, no one is coming. And I was like, what the hell are they talking about? And they're like, no one is coming. And when I understood what they meant was that I was approaching the work in a way where I thought someone would come in and help me to do this thing. Or if I met this one person, that it would change the work or I would have more access. And once I realized that, like, I was the answer that I had been looking for, I was able to approach the work in a much different manner. So if I could give anybody anything, it's like, those problems that you are trying to solve, you are the answer to those problems. So it's up to you to solve the problems, because no one is going to come in and help you to solve things that are problematic for you or things that you want to change. Like, you are the answer because no one is coming. So if you attack the issue as if you are the only one to do this thing with like that reckless abandon, I think that people can solve all of the issues in the country.
That's so powerful. Sarita, if you could get to the very root of why you do what you do, what's the driving force on a day-to-day basis? Because I know sometimes you're dealing with really difficult situations, really heartbreaking stories. What makes you get up every single day? What's your driving force or the root of why you do what you do?
Because I never wanted anybody to feel how I felt being released from prison. I could say that is the top reason. Like, I don't think that anybody should have to go through that after going through what they had just been through. But then also for me, it's like a life or death situation. I feel like, we are dying at alarming rates, whether that's lack of access to, healthcare, whether that is, the horrible conditions that you face while you're incarcerated, the lack of medical care, just like all of these different things. Formerly incarcerated folks have a lower life expectancy. So for me, it's literally like a life or death situation. Like, how do we free as many people and bring as many people into liberation? Because the longer you're incarcerated also affects your lifespan. So I want to make sure that we're living and we're thriving and we are making differences in our communities. But a lot of us have families just like everybody else. So we deserve to be around for our families, so making sure that people know that we deserve another chance, whether they feel like we deserve it or not. Just our humanity calls for that.
Sarita, what can people do to support your work and how can they get involved in what you're doing at Operation Restoration?
So absolutely. Of course, the website is www.or-nola.org. You can go on there and see any of the programs. You can donate, you can volunteer. We definitely don't think that anything is too small and anybody's time is not worth having. So if you have a skill that you can donate, if you have a time frame, like a lot of, for instance, formerly incarcerated folks suffer with technology. If your expertise is technology, it takes nothing in this new age of Zoom to do one-on-ones to volunteer. So you don't have to be here in New Orleans. Currency travels across every state line and nationally. So we always can use currency donations, but then also just making sure that, like you can show up in your community, like there are multiple organizations across the country that are doing work with formerly incarcerated women. Like, get involved, lend your expertise. If you want to donate, if you want to cook, if you want to just, go and visit someone who's incarcerated. Like, there are so many ways to get involved.
Write cards. I had somebody on the podcast the other day that was saying, reach out to your local jail or prison and find out, get a list of names and write birthday cards to people or write little cards just thinking of you. It doesn't have to even be detailed, but it's always the little things that we do in our own communities. But I hope that people get involved in the great work that you're doing. I will be sure to put your website, your social media links, like get everybody to follow you and all that you're doing. I always tell people that social media is a free way to get involved and to support organizations like yours. So I will be sure to put all the links in the show notes. Syrita, I have one final question for you. I always end this podcast on one question. So I want to ask you, if you could leave women and girls around the world with one message, what would it be?
It would definitely be that somebody is out here fighting for you and somebody cares about you and somebody loves you. Because I always say that while I was incarcerated, I never heard the good stories ever. The only thing that you would hear is people coming back in and saying about how hard it is. Like, I did not know that they had people out in the free world fighting for my rights or fighting for me to be liberated or like any of these things. So if I could leave them with one message for my women that are incarcerated and girls that are incarcerated, there is someone out here that cares, that's fighting for your liberation and will be here for you when you get out. And I think if it's for my sisters that are already out and they are trying to navigate a space of like reentry as a whole, to let them know that there are so many positive stories that they can also do it. They just need to be able to get connected to people that could support them through the process.
Syrita, you are such a beacon of light, and I'm just so grateful for all the great work that you do. Thank you for being on the podcast, and thank you for sharing all about your great work and your story.
Thank you so much for having me. It's been a pleasure talking to you today.
Please follow us on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram at One Girl Revo. That's the number one girl REVO. And you can find more information on One Girl Revolution at onegirlrevolution.com. That's the number one girlrevolution.com.